rather than seeing themselves in Kyiv by Christmas or whatever, it looks like they're now trying to basically just break Ukraine, break its will to resist, and ideally take places like Odessa, Kharkiv, and some of the others, and make Ukraine essentially not viable as an economy without Russian support or involvement.
Joining us here in the studio, Matthew Savill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Matthew, hello.
Good evening.
We'll talk a little bit about Trump in a second, but we know that Vladimir Putin at the moment is in China. There is a show of strength from those leaders. Modi of India has actually left, but when you take India, Russia and China, they are something like 40% of the world's population. They have huge economic might behind them. Modi may have left, but Kim Jong-un has arrived in his armoured train today. He doesn't like to fly, does he? He'll be attending the military parades. It'll be the vision tomorrow, I suppose, of Putin stood shoulder to shoulder with President Xi and Kim Jong-un, which will cause ripples in Washington. I'm not entirely sure whether Donald Trump will dignify a reaction to that, but he may certainly be asked about it tonight.
I mean, possibly. I mean, a lot of my colleagues who are much more better versed in geopolitics than I would point out that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has talked a lot and delivered relatively little over time. And if we're looking at a lot of these international organizations that sort of ape some of the alliances that we have in the West, none of them have really matched up to the kind of the longevity or the actual material impact that things like NATO have done. But the way that these countries work together is a reminder that there are a whole series of competing interests out there. I think the particular point of interest won't necessarily be Russia and China. It will be India's presence there because, of course, an enormous amount of effort has gone into improving relations with India recently, and then the tariffs seem to have sort of dropped a depth charge into US-Indian relations, and now people are concerned that a country that not that long ago had its troops physically fighting Chinese soldiers over a territorial dispute are smoothing things over when India should really be leaning, in a different way, although I suspect a lot of people in India would reject the idea that they have to lean either way.
Yeah, and if they've been punished by Donald Trump for buying Russian oil, which way should they be leading? Should they be keeping their options open? There's a huge guest list, by the way, over in China at the moment. It includes all manner of presidents, from the president of Uzbekistan, the Cambodian king, the Vietnamese president, the Pakistani prime minister, the Iranian president is there as well. Robert Fico of Slovakia was there, and the EU had to come out and say he's not there as an official EU delegate at all, keeping their distance from him. Putin has been speaking to President Xi today. A couple of things have come up. One is Putin insisting that actually Donald Trump now has more of an understanding as to why Russia decided to invade Ukraine. The Trump administration's now listening to Russia's justifications, said Vladimir Putin. He's also said that they've got no issue with Ukraine joining the EU, but they do draw the line with NATO. What will have been going on behind closed doors there in terms of China? And we can bring North Korea into this because we know that they've supported Putin in this war. What discussions will be going on behind closed doors, do you think?
Well, I think some of it will be the broader, if you like, the geopolitics, the question of posing a challenge to the current international order, although there is some difference between what Russia and China are actually doing. I mean, this is enormously simplistic, but in some respects, Russia's are sort of vandals who want to kind of break things down and make sure that strong countries can do what they will. China is attempting to, if you like, alter the way that the current international system works so that it works more to its benefit. The irony being that its rise has been aided by joining a number of international systems and institutions and organisations that were set up largely under US and Western leadership. I think in terms of discussing Ukraine, there will probably be some interesting continued support behind the scenes. It's worth noting there that that's not currently in the form of like large amounts of like obvious weapons, but the Chinese components in particular, and what we might call dual use components, are key to a lot of the weapons that Russia continues to manufacture and use in Ukraine. And so making sure that that supply isn't going to be affected, and that if there is any sanctions action taken by the US, which is open to question, aimed at Russia, that the Chinese will help the Russians with that.
Yeah, China, of course, buys Russian oil. There's been a statement from David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, the UK Foreign Secretary, today in the House, saying that the government will be announcing more sanctions on Russia soon. So we'll expect that within the next few days, one understands. There are also reports coming out of Russia that actually their territorial gain is not as significant as we might be being led to understand. But certainly from the Kremlin. I mean, when on earth could you trust anything from the Kremlin anyway? But the general consensus had been that Russia's doing pretty well over there, certainly better than Ukraine. But this has come under the spotlight a bit. These are only reports coming out of the region. What do you understand as the situation?
So there's an interesting question about how do we measure the progress. My understanding of this particular thing is that it's something that the Institute for the Study of the War, who do a lot of work on tracking Russia and what's going on in Ukraine, have highlighted that a lot of the Russian military bloggers have criticised the Russian military leadership over their claims. So what they're reporting on is essentially Russian internal criticism. And there is this interesting community who have been increasingly vocal and vociferous about the progress of the war and aimed that criticism at corrupt military leadership or people who aren't doing what they're supposed to. So it sounds like the Russian military have been slightly over-egging it. What we understand is that around 20%, just over or just under, depending on who you speak to, of Ukraine's territory is currently being controlled by Russian forces. But I think it is increasingly the case that is a difficult judgment to make, because what does control mean? Obviously, weapons can reach much further. We can talk a little bit about how people evaluate this. But what is interestingly happening in a lot of places now is that the lines are becoming blurred, and rather than having defined front lines, some of the trenches that people have seen, what you actually have is an intermingling, particularly as the Russians are trying to now infiltrate past the Ukrainians, dig in, and then attack that way. So what you now have is a larger, if you like, contact zone. And that is partly a product of Russian tactics. It's partly a product of the fact the Ukrainians are very thinly stretched in many areas of the front. That's why they have the so-called drone wall, surveillance and strike drones to compensate for small numbers of people holding kilometres at a time.
Gosh, so it sort of can be quite a fractured picture when you look in depth at it. And I'm curious to hear about those. They're called mill bloggers who assess how Russia's really doing in this war. They are Russian war observers, but they are not afraid to criticise the progress that the Kremlin says that they're making, and how that may not be actually the case. The 1 week deadline that Trump set Vladimir Putin to meet or to arrange to meet President Zelensky of Ukraine has passed. There's another week deadline, or we are into another week of another deadline. Where is this going? I mean, the general consensus is a meeting's off the cards, particularly when Russia launched that attack last week overnight on Kyiv, a really significant drone and missile attack, that all discussions of ceasefire are now off. Is that what you understand?
I think the Russians, as they were before Alaska, are playing for time. Our understanding is that they are still attempting to achieve their original goals, which is to pull Ukraine out of what they see as the Western orbit, the Western sphere of influence, and back into their own. And therefore, they were never really serious about a major cessation of violence. They'd welcome that if they thought they could reset, refit forces, go again quite quickly, but they are quite content, at least for the rest of this year, to keep grinding forwards and wait out, grind down the Ukrainians. What is changing is I think that they reflect that, they've completely missed all of their deadlines for capturing the 4 oblasts plus Crimea by Russian Victory Day. They haven't taken Pokrovsk, which is that city that's been slowly surrounded over the past year. So rather than seeing themselves in Kyiv by Christmas or whatever, it looks like they're now trying to basically just break Ukraine, break its will to resist, and ideally take places like Odessa, Kharkiv, and some of the others, and make Ukraine essentially not viable as an economy without Russian support or involvement.
Yeah, because Russian control is over key areas and key cities, if not areas. Yeah. So there's so much Russian involvement intermingled in that country, it becomes hard for them to operate as an independent country. They are sewn into Russia, and Russia is sewn into it. Interesting. Look, Matthew Savill, always so fascinating to speak to you. Thank you. As we prepare to hear from Donald Trump this evening, he'll be live at the White House making an announcement with questions from journalists afterwards. So we'll keep across that for you on the show tonight. And also just observing what is going on in China at the moment with this huge show of not just military strength, but also economic strength as well, population strength. If you add up all the people who live in countries like India, Russia, China, etc. So lots to comment on. Matthew, good to see you. Matthew is Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. This is Kate Borsay. It is the evening edition.